All right, good evening, folks. We are going to start our pre-City Council meeting with a presentation on floodplains. I'm going to ask our Director of Public Works to introduce our guest and to talk about what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes.
Great, thank you. We're all set. Appreciate having an opportunity to have Mr. Musico here. William Musico is the Senior Permitting Services Specialist for the Floodplain Administration within Montgomery County's Department of Permitting Services. He kindly answered the phone and agreed to come and give us kind of a general overview about floodplains in general, as well as specific county requirements relative to construction or how you manage floodplains. And we thought it'd be helpful in preparation for the future discussions about library construction to get some of that background. So without any further ado, Mr. Musico, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bill Musico. You can get my number or I'll distribute it. And I'm actually a resource for everyone. My title is the Floodplain Administrator for Montgomery County. As you're aware, in government, you wear many hats. So I do sediment control, stormwater management, along with a team of 8 other people in the Water Resources District. But I'm the designated floodplain administrator, and that designation comes through FEMA straight to the community that is the NFIP representative. So for Montgomery County, we represent all unincorporated areas. Now that Tacoma Park is an incorporated area, there's also many smaller unincorporated areas that have not incorporated for the purposes of their own floodplain management. We have only 2 that have done so. It's the city of Rockville and Gaithersburg. So they do their own floodplain management and they get the designation from FEMA. And FEMA takes it relatively seriously because of the amount of federally backed flood insurance money that they provide. Montgomery County has got over $1 billion in federal backed flood insurance. That means when people's homes are flooded and they have insurance through the federal government, that insurance is guaranteed. So, but in order to get that, you have to be a participating community. So there's this whole set of responsibilities that the community has to do, whether they are a county or a city like Rockville, and sometimes you can even go down to smaller towns. It's obviously easier for cities to represent themselves because they know themselves better, more intimately, but it more often than not turns to a county level responsibility. It's not delegated through MDE, which is one of the nuances where normally for our other regulatory roles, it's delegated through MDE. This actually comes directly from FEMA. We work within our state charter. So then my responsibility becomes just helping everybody. It doesn't matter whether you are a citizen that is interested in buying a new home and you want to know what that stream behind your house looks like. Is it a floodplain? Is it not? What can you tell me about it? Or whether you're a developer or, in this case, Tacoma looking to do improvements to a public facility, you're treated no differently than any other developer held to the same regulations and requirements. So I'd like to start off with what is flooding and the difference between flooding and floodplains and floodplain management. And please interrupt me as often as you like. I spent nearly 20 years in hydraulics and hydrology before I got to this position, and I thought I knew a lot. And then I got really confused really quickly until it started clicking in my head as far as what is a floodplain, what is not, what's the difference between flooding and how are they what's the regulatory requirements? Okay, flooding is catastrophic no matter how you look at it. If you have a burst pipe in your second floor house and your first and second floor gets flooded, it's catastrophic. It's life-changing. And I try to remember that with everybody that comes to me, because you never know what their situation is. It could be as easy as small as wet shoes, an inconvenience, property damage. It could be loss of life. But for what we're talking about, flooding is this innocuous definition of temporary inundation of normally dry lands. That's what flooding is. And it means a lot of different things to different people. But that's not really what I regulate, okay? I have no regulatory authority of something that's not called a floodplain. And it has to meet very strict definitions. It doesn't mean you're damaged. You can have poor grading on a site that results in catastrophic damage to persons and their belongings and their houses. But if it doesn't meet these minimum requirements, it's not a floodplain. It never was held to these regulatory requirements. It's just an overland drainage problem, okay? Makes it sound a lot less severe, but it doesn't matter whether it comes from a floodplain or it comes from a burst pipe or how it gets there. So a floodplain is a relatively flat or low-lying area adjoining a river, stream, pond, stormwater management structure, or watercourse. Take that to mean any water area that is subject to rapid accumulation. It's resulting from what we call a 100-year event, and the drainage area to this place must be at least 30 acres. So drainage area means it's kind of simple when you think of large areas, like the Chesapeake Bay has a drainage area of most of the Northeast, but a swale that's running down your property, it's kind of hard to tell what the drainage area is. And 30 acres is actually one of the most restrictive interpretations of what a floodplain is. The federal government starts considering drainage courses of about 1 square mile, or 640 acres. We're looking at 30 acres. So it doesn't mean that you being in the course of that stream, let's say you have a stream that has 50 acres to it, if your car is swept up by that, it's just as impactful for you. But many municipalities won't consider that a floodplain. We would consider it a floodplain issue, so it has additional regulatory hurdles to overcome before you do anything in that area. When is a permit required? When you're working in a floodplain, or within 25 feet of a floodplain, any floodplain, and I'll get back to what I mean by any floodplain, yes, ma'am.
Can we back up just a second to the part B of the floodplain definition?
Yes.
And it says, as a result of an upstream dam failure. So
Yes.
if it's an area with 30 acres of drainage, subject to unusual and rapid accumulation, et cetera, and it's not adjoining a river, stream, pond, et cetera, then it's not a floodplain?
So that is in addition to the definition of a floodplain, and it's very important for many jurisdictions, not so much for Tacoma Park.
Okay.
What it means is that if you are downstream of any size pond, and a dam breach analysis is performed on that pond, and the inundation area says the water surface will rise to this, our county code says we're going to consider that also a floodplain, regardless of the drainage area to it, regardless of the event that caused it. You can have breaches that are not caused by a 100-year, but and if we wanted to go past the slides that I presented for you, you can see how many communities in Montgomery County, specifically Rockville, downstream of Lake Needwood, we have about 2,500 properties that are affected by a dam breach. That doesn't mean there's structures necessarily in it, but they're there. So it's a special consideration.
Thank you.
Yes. So when is a permit required? And this is one of those instances where confusion can start in, because I'm talking now about a floodplain permit or a floodplain district permit. And this is simply the opportunity for the county to say, oh, we've looked at all the things that you propose. We're not doing a hydraulic analysis. We're not looking at where the water is, but we say you already have an understanding of where your floodplain is. You want to put these things in there. Some things are allowed in the floodplain. Some things are not. We take a look at which things are and which things aren't. It is the trigger for us as a regulatory agency to make certain non-conforming structures aren't put in a floodplain. And it's quite simply as, if you're working in the floodplain or within 25 feet of it, you're going to need to get this additional permit prior to getting your sediment control, which means prior to getting any building permit, you'll need this. There's no good place to show this, so I stuck it in here where the 30-acre drainage is. This is a map, Montgomery County, and I've tried to show how many areas there are with unmapped floodplains that we know of, that we still consider floodplains from a regulatory purpose. And I'd like to clarify that when I'm talking regulatory, I'm not talking insurance, okay? We are an NFIP participating community, but all of these little pink lines are areas where we know a floodplain the water surface would meet the definition of a floodplain. So there's far more areas that are affected or are close to water courses with a drainage area of 30 acres or more. We haven't done studies on all of them, okay? FEMA stops doing their studies at 1 acre, and you can see their studies in the light blue. I've actually shown some of those dam breach areas on here as the light green. You can see how they go much wider than, and just for reference, this is all from Lake Needwood. This is an inundation from a dam breach that is much further north, okay? But the important thing to look at this is that we've got many more delineations yet to be done for our understanding. So if a person were to call me that's adjacent to one of these streams that has a drainage area of greater than 30 acres, I could tell them, you absolutely have a floodplain near you. I cannot tell you how deep the water flows, how close it runs to your house, because we haven't done a study on it, okay? Since we started tracking these things in the 1980s, DPS has recorded some 770 floodplain studies that we reviewed from engineers, okay? Since 2015, from like 1995 to 2015, we had some 700, of which 125 we could get metadata to say it's located here, because it's a big permitting system. Old paper plans don't scan well, they don't translate into a digital. Since 2015, we've been trying to, whenever we do a floodplain delineation, I should be clear, whenever an engineer submits a floodplain delineation to us and we approve it, we require them to submit GIS information so we can post that so it's easy for us to see. And the dark blue areas that you see up by Wheaton are some examples of those studies that have been submitted by engineers that we've reviewed and approved and now add to our floodplain database. If you have very keen eyesight, you'll always notice that Montgomery County floodplains are always bigger than FEMA floodplains. Isn't a floodplain the floodplain? Isn't a 100-year event always the 100-year event? It all depends on the way you interpret your requirements for what that 100-year inundation is. And I'll get to that in a moment. But for at this point, you can just notice that we've got hatched areas that Park and Planning did back in the 70s. We have more recent ones that we have done, and they're always larger than FEMA. Okay. So what is a 100-year event? And I'm kind of proud of this because these are, on the right-hand side is artwork from my daughter. I I have it posted outside my office just because it's kind of funny. They gave me both of these. Everyone teases me that the bottom one is very grim looking, and the other one is so shiny and happy, with the exception of these really dark clouds. And Emily knows exactly what Daddy does, and she has a lot of questions about, are we going to get flooded? When is that? What is this? So, but on a lighter note, what is this design event that we're looking at? This is the 100-year design event, and it's obviously referring to rainfall. So it refers to the estimated probability of a storm event happening in any given year. So if you're good with statistics, you'll realize what happened in year 1 has no bearing on year 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I throw out what these design events are for Montgomery County, and you can see how the accumulated rainfall, this is depth in inches over a 24-hour period. That's just one of the events that we look at as the 24-hour, but it's the most typical. So for the 100-year, we're talking about 7.2 inches on average. That used to be the number we used always everywhere, but we've updated and we realize some locations get more, some get less, so now we're required to use what's NOAA Atlas 14, which is a distributed rainfall amount. It varies much more by location. But this is really useful for saying, oh, wow, a 100-year event, 7.2 inches in a 24-hour period. But if you look at it, half of the 50-year event, which is half the probability, is still got 6.3 inches. And these are numbers that we got. I've been using these same numbers for 20 years. So they haven't updated. We didn't even start thinking about global warming 20 years ago affecting these numbers. We're trying to wrap our heads around what that means. These are still the numbers we use, okay? Yes?
So did you say you're required to use the NOAA Atlas 14?
But the state has required that we use what's called NOAA Atlas 14.
So that's a state requirement that defines what set of data you use to get the 100-year flood, and as you say, it's 20 years old.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Well, no, Atlas 14
It's not.
is probably 2 or 3 years old.
Okay.
But
Thank you. I feel better.
no, they have been updated, and Atlas 14 is updating its rainfall patterns, and it's 14 because it's the 14th instance of this. But they haven't significantly increased these rainfall amounts for things like global warming. Okay, this is still based off of history, which we only have so much history to look back on.
Thank you.
And can I just ask,
Yes, sir.
how many of these higher ones have you seen in the amount of time that you've been working for the county doing that? I mean, what's the highest
many have you
level
seen
have
in
you
the last 5
seen?
years?
Yeah.
It's a great question, and I should have my notes up here because I'd like to point out we've never seen a design event. A design event is this one set of scenarios where you say, this is what we're going to design to. We're going to try to keep the roads clear. We're going to try to keep these primary arterial roads clear on the 100-year event. Where did we come up with that 100-year? Somebody picked it. Somebody said, we want to keep it clear for 100. And then we had very smart people look back at history and say, okay, the probability of the 100-year event over a 24-hour period is 7.2 inches. But then if you say, what's that same 100-year event for a 12-hour storm, the intensity goes much further. So you won't get quite 7.2 inches, you may get 5, but the amount of rain you receive in inches per hour could have easily doubled, okay? The total amount of rainfall will be less. It'll never get more than 7.2 inches over that 24-hour period. That's the longest period. But you may see a much greater intensity. And that is why one of the things that we are looking at, we've always considered what is the time of concentration for a watershed. The time of concentration is defined as how long does it take for that raindrop that's hitting the most remote part of the watershed to work its way down to the bottom. And that's important because that's when that watershed is fully contributing to the flow at your study point, okay? So if your watershed has a 12-hour time of concentration, that means at hour 6, the whole watershed isn't contributing the flow at this study point, okay? If you have a 12-hour storm on a 12-hour watershed, then you've reached that peak potential for this point here, okay? If you happen to get a much more distributed rainfall on this smaller watershed, it would actually be better for you. It might be worse for the people downstream that have a higher time of concentration, but there are many events, and that's why the look into the higher intensity frequency storms that we're seeing much more of are probably changing what we see as a 100-year floodplain. I can't tell you how many I've seen. It's very hard. Meteorologists will sometimes say, that was a 100-year event. And then you'll look at it and you'll be like, that was only so many inches. And that was over this duration. That was not a 100-year event. Or that was well exceeding a 100-year event. So it's a design scenario that we've chosen to say, this is where we really got to get serious about protecting people and property. Yes, ma'am.
So I know you have a number of slides that we need to go through. The one question that has been raised by staff is that when we have had rain several times during a week so that there's just no capacity for anything to seep in, it just to me feels like the water accumulates faster because it's, it's just surface. Mm-hmm. And I don't, to me, extrapolating what an event is given that change, I think is one of our realities that we're trying to deal with.
It is difficult. We don't take that into consideration when doing a floodplain delineation. What was the antecedent moisture condition, which the base flow? We probably have now presently the computer strength to do the detailed models, but you can't throw that much money at every study that you'd like to do. They're already very complicated. Finding an engineer that can do a detailed floodplain delineation study of the number of engineers that are professionally licensed is selective. Not many of them won't do it. Okay, it's just one of those select set of skills that requires specialization in, and there's too many other aspects that are consuming their time. So this is a good place to talk about probability and risk and what that means, because I've seen both sides as being a floodplain administrator. I see people that come in and are very upset with us that are saying that we are crushing their dreams because we're not going to permit them to put this structure in the floodplain, okay? And then we'll see the opposite, where we'll get park and planning or other non-governmental agency comments that saying we are regulating this too relaxed, and we should be more restrictive in how we interpret the laws. And there is very little interpretation to what we do with the laws. It's pretty clear. But when it comes to basic probability, 1 in 100, that's pretty easy to understand. But the one point I like to point out with this, if you've ever bought a home, what's your mortgage on that home? It's generally a 30-year mortgage. And a lot of people will come in and say, this place has a floodplain on it. I'm okay with 1 in 100. I'm okay. I'm good with odds. I'm pretty lucky. I'm good with that. If you own that home for the full 30 years, you have a 26% chance of receiving a flooding event. Considering the amount of payoff that you get from an insured property, if you're lucky enough to get insured, where it's capped at $250,000 and a lot of times doesn't include your belongings, that's a big gamble you just played. And at 26%, take out a coin, Flip it 2 times. If you got heads 2 times, that's 25%. You were flooded once in your 30-year ownership of that home. So now we have to start talking about what is a flood. We talked about what a floodplain is and what is an acceptable source of a floodplain delineation. A delineation means a mapping of that inundated water surface area. Okay, we're trying to represent on a map so that you can drive up to a house and say, this is in a floodplain, that is not. The water will come over here, but it's not going to come over here. That's the process of a delineation. So our acceptable sources in Montgomery County are FEMA flood insurance rates maps and flood boundary and floodway maps. These are the things that affect your insurance. All these other county floodplains, park and planning floodplains, unless they're registered by FEMA as an NFIP floodplain, it doesn't matter. You could have your house in the middle of a 80-acre stream, or sometimes even larger where FEMA hasn't delineated a 120-acre stream, and you could have your house in the middle of it, and there's no requirement for you to have flood insurance because it's not an NFIP floodplain, a National Flood Insurance Program floodplain, okay? So we accept their floodplains. We also accept previously engineered floodplain studies that were approved by either the Department of Permitting Services or Park and Planning when they used to do it. And they stopped doing it last one, I think, in '85. But we still honor those, okay? And then for single-family houses, we have a little bit of a conundrum, because if you look back at that map, you saw a lot of streams that are probably adjacent to a lot of houses. If we required every one of them to do a floodplain delineation study just for their development, we wouldn't have any development in Montgomery County. Floodplain studies are very expensive, tens of thousands of dollars easily just to do your study to know where that water line is so you can design around it. But for single-family homes, if we have a record plat that showed the engineer's opinion who designed the subdivision of that 100-year water surface, we'll accept it within reason, as long as the proposed home is not building too close to that area, okay? And the rule of thumb that we use is about 3 foot, because 3 foot is the higher regulatory standard that FEMA will prescribe to agencies as the best higher regulatory standard. In Montgomery County, we are 1 foot above the floodplain for your lowest floor. Some communities go higher. When we're looking at an approximate floodplain like this, something that hasn't gone as through a rigorous review, we'd say, all right, we're not going to make you do a full floodplain study as long as you've got a good vertical separation between your house and what we anticipate the water surface, or what this approximate water surface elevation to be. Unacceptable, unofficial floodplains are, and you'll hear this one every day, I've lived here for 50 years, and it is never flooded once. Or I've lived here for 50 years and that street always floods. So and perception of what happens in a flooding is so subjective. Our ability to perceive risk and objectively perceive what's happening over a long period of time is fatally flawed. When people have their neighbor developing beside them and their basement gets flooded, it's immediately their neighbor's fault, even though their neighbor is lower than they are and they couldn't have backed up the stream. But it is their perception, because I have an event, my neighbor did some construction and I got flooded. I see a direct correlation. So our ability to perceive risk and probability over time is just poor. So how is a floodplain delineated? And this is where we start to get into what an engineer needs to submit to me when doing a floodplain delineation study. We talked about the permit. The permit is when you already have a delineation done by FEMA, Park and Planning, or us. Somewhere along the line, somebody mapped it. I'll talk about the process here. The floodplain delineation starts with the hydrologic evaluation of your watershed. So we take a look at what does your watershed look like? What's the zoning of it? Montgomery County says, what's your zoning? And we're gonna assume that everybody has built their McMansion on their lot and they've paid as much as they can upstream of you. And we're gonna use that as the hydrologic, the determining of how much water runs off of the ground for any given rainfall event. Rainfall runoff is determined from soil conditions, impervious conditions, and the combination of those two with the amount of rainfall will determine how much water is actually running off the ground. So there's the key difference between Montgomery County, us, and FEMA. We say, you have to assume, Mr. Developer or anybody, that this watershed has been completely developed. It doesn't mean much for the Tacoma Park because your watershed has been very much developed. It's not got too much more. It means a lot for some of the northern watersheds where there's still a lot of development to be had. So that's why Montgomery County floodplains are always larger, because the amount of flows we get are always going to be larger. We assume a greater amount of imperviousness, a greater amount of development. So we start with that, and then we do a hydrologic or a hydraulic calculation of what's that water going to look like when it flows through a stream and a channel. We assume that storm drains are clogged. We don't have to worry about that because most of the time they are. Not bridges and culverts, but storm drains. And we try to develop a water surface elevation for that stream at every station. And then we superimpose that on a digital terrain model, and that gives you the shape of the floodplain. It overlays the two, so now you can say, this house is in a floodplain, or this house isn't. It's a model. It's an extrapolation of reality. It's the best that we have. It's not perfect. So when you're looking at these things, you should probably, if you're a homeowner, you should be considering what could happen in the future as far as when you have the opportunity to build or redevelop, or you're a municipality and you're saying, I want to put some additional features in. The delineation that you do today will consider the upland hydrology to be fully developed. So we've done that, at least that much. What we haven't got a good handle on, we talked about it, is there a change to weather patterns? Are the amounts of rainfall changing? So if the amount of rainfall are changing, it's obviously going to affect it. So I'll skim this. This is a lot of engineer speak that I don't really need. If you were interested, you probably were already reading this and you have some questions. Otherwise, I'll just let it pass that the state and our county has guidelines for what constitutes the minimal acceptable standards for determining a floodplain. We take those seriously, but we don't try to overreach. This is the only thing we can ask for. We can't ask for the 500-year unless you're a federal government putting in a sensitive facility. So what does this look like? This is an example of a floodplain delineation that was done for, what's the museum, Mitchell Rails Museum? Glenstone. They've done a lot of work in a floodplain. They did work to this minor swale. And if you look closely at this swale, there's a portion that's indicated as DA greater than 30 acres where I highlighted it. And that's where the engineer is providing that little bit of information to me saying the drainage area on this side of the line is 29.999, and as soon as I cross this line, now the drainage area changed to 30 acres. So that water surface elevation before the line, I don't regulate. After the line, we now call it a floodplain, and we regulate it totally different. If you get within 25 feet of it, now I have to look at your floodplain district permit. If you change the cross sections in that area, I may ask you to do a floodplain delineation study to remodel this. So it's useful to just see what it ends up with. And you'll also see some other highlighted lines where we highlighted FEMA's line and a previously delineated Montgomery County floodplain delineation study. So the county ones, whenever we do a new study, we overwrite that data, and as long as it was constructed per the approved plan, per the assumptions, this is the new floodplain for Montgomery County. The old ones disappear. The ones that Park and Planning did and all that. I can't modify FEMA floodplains. I can't modify state floodplains, but though we don't have any legal requirement to look at those. So when a situation like this happens, the developer has to go through another step and has to do a conditional letter of map amendment or a letter of map amendment to adjust the floodplain map that FEMA has.
If you can go back just for 1 second. I
Yes.
know one thing that I'd seen a little bit on the preliminary work that we did for this site was that the elevation changes as it goes down. So it's
Yes.
not just one flat elevation that's the
Yes.
floodplain, right?
Mhm.
It changes as it's moving.
If you look
downgrade.
if you can look closely on this, you'll see some squiggly lines in the lower right-hand corner. I can point to them. Is there a way for you? Oh, you can do that here? All right. Use the mouse. Okay. So there we go. There we go. See this squiggly line and the 244 feet? And there's 243 feet. And you'll see another one over there. That just is showing you where the elevation is as it, the elevation of the water surface of this reach as it goes downstream. Water is flowing from the bottom of the page to the top of the page in this case, and it's always going down in elevation. Relatively, that water still may be getting deeper depending on where the ground is and how it's situated. So we've talked about this, I think. A floodplain study is basically an if-then scenario. If this proposed construction is implemented, then the 100-year floodplain would look like this. So the first part in our regulatory requirement, when a floodplain is being affected, we like to understand how it's being affected. You could have a proposed construction that says, I want to build a dam, and I'm going to flood so many acres. Okay. We're going to look at that study, evaluate it scientifically with sound engineering principles, and we're going to see if you've done that study correctly. And we'll say, okay, if you built this dam, you would flood this many houses upstream of you. It's no evaluation of value. It's just identifying what happens. And then it's up for the developer or whoever to say, okay, if I really wanted to go through with this, I need to get permission from the upstream properties, buy their properties out, or do what is necessary. State law requires that if there's an increase on your property due to a floodplain, that increase needs to be either secured by purchase of the property, designation of a floodplain instrument, floodplain easement, or some other means acceptable to the administration. So depending on what the impact is, and in this case the administration is DPS, because we would be reviewing the floodplain studies at a local level. If it's just impacting agricultural area, it just might be a letter from the farmer saying, I agree to this increase to the floodplain on my property. We won't allow it to cause any structures to become existing non-conforming, to become in violation of floodplain laws. If that would happen, we'd require the purchase and the removal of those structures prior to the approval of the sediment control plan. That would do this. So it's an if-then statement. And the primary purpose of the floodplain impact review is to make sure that flood hazards are not increased. There's not increase to flooding to existing structures or adjacent properties without consent. Vacant or undeveloped land within the 100-year floodplain is not inversely impacted by proposed activity or means of effective limitation of the other's developable rights. So if you're downstream, or if somebody upstream of you hasn't yet built on their lot, that doesn't mean you can just flood them out, even though there's no structure there. They have a certain expected developable right to the property that they own. And then the last one is, or not the last one, activities are constructed to withstand the passage of the 100-year flood. So we don't pick up a bridge or something and float it down to our downstream properties, causing more damage. And the last one is aquatic resources are adequately protected, stream designation is minimized. This is outside of the Department of Permitting Services review. It's a Chapter 22 review. Park and Planning takes the lead agency on what those reviews are. So we at DPS will look at an engineer's study and we'll say, we agree with your study, with your findings. If you did this construction, this would be the impact to the floodplain. This is what it looks like. You take that to Park and Planning and see if Park and Planning has a problem with what we've done. They can't argue the method of delineation, where the line ends up. They can say, there's particular value to this area that's now been flooded and we don't want it. So it's not 100% in the Department of Permitting Services hands. Park and Planning could, if they had an environmental resource, step in and say, we need to find other means of protecting it. So when is a revised floodplain study? We had floodplain studies by FEMA, by county, and we know where they are, or you've done one years ago, but now you want to do something else to your property. When is a revised floodplain delineation study required? When do we need you to remap that 100-year floodplain? Technically, any disturbance in a floodplain where the effect wouldn't, I'm saying double negatives here on purpose, it has to be patently obvious that the effect on the floodplain would be de minimis to no effect by any engineer with sound judgment. Otherwise, a floodplain delineation study is required. If somebody could look at this, if an engineer with sound judgment could look at this and say, I could see a scenario where this would cause adverse flooding, where this would cause something, you should have done a floodplain delineation study. Then a study is required. We do have mechanisms for simplifying that floodplain delineation study when you're only looking at one small aspect. If you're just looking at your property and a culvert on your property and the effects of how you change this floodplain are obviously going to be well within your property, and you've agreed to not put anything near this culvert which you would adversely impact, we could say that's a simplified study. We'll do it through simple routing of an estimated 100-year flow through a Manning's equation of a culvert and an overtopping the road. Easy peasy, you're done. Okay, we try to introduce ways to unclutter this when a floodplain delineation study shouldn't be required, but there's a little uncertainty and we need to look at it a little bit further. So we'll do an approximate floodplain delineation study for that. The other condition is any work in a floodplain. If it's a NFIP floodplain, a CLOMAR is also going to be required from FEMA. CLOMAR is conditional letter of map revision. It's what FEMA does prior to your development to say, we've reviewed your findings and we would allow you to do what you propose to do. FEMA says that anytime there's work in the floodway, anytime the proposed increase in the floodplain could be a foot or more, we want to see a CLOMAR of this floodplain study to evaluate it prior to moving forward with construction. And here's the approximate floodplains where we can get our authority. We can estimate them from stream valley bank, stream valley protection areas, and I already mentioned about how we can use an approximate determination using simplified hydrologic or hydraulic methods to determine an approximate floodplain elevation. And of course, there's always an exemption there somewhere. There's a DNR policy that said DOTs, county, state DOTs, when replacing a bridge, either exactly in kind, hydraulically in kind, or that meets the specific requirements of this policy, don't need to go through a floodplain delineation study. They can just say it's hydraulically equivalent, let's move on. Oh, that was it. I have citations. I have further slides that show about dam impacted areas, but there probably is not much interest to you at Tacoma Park.
Yeah, so the time that we really have is just about up.
Yeah, I think we'll push it a little bit just to ask some questions. And I guess thank you first for coming this evening. We very much appreciate it. And I know we're still going through our floodplain study and everything. I guess as we move, excuse me, forward in thinking about the library renovations and what we need to do, can you just put into context all of this and how it then relates to the work we're going to be doing as we move forward in the library?
Okay, so as a non-residential application, you have some liberties that we would not allow to residents, okay? You may do things such as floodproofing, wet or dry. The process is still going to be the same for you. Your engineer is going to do a floodplain delineation study based off of how you're changing the site. And he's going to develop an estimated flow. And he's going to say, flow is going to come onto the site here. These are going to be the affects of your changes to your site. And remember that starting at the uppermost part of your property, there's not a lot of changes you can do to your site because that could adversely affect the person upstream of you, unless you get their permission, of course. So it's about how you convey this water through your site. And conveyance, the water doesn't recognize a building anything more than a wall or an obstruction. So as a municipality, as a non-residential, you could say, we will put in passive, preferably passive, floodproofing, dry floodproofing measures, meaning things that you do not have to go out and put up to prevent the water from entering your site. Okay? Active dry floodproofing measures are much less reliable because they require somebody to go out and do something prior to the event that happens. So let's look at the stream course. Then I wish Jason was here, but what's the time of concentration for the stream that's coming down here? It's probably not more than 12 hours. What's the lead time that any facilities manager has to implement any active floodproofing measures that he has? If he has perfect forethought of how bad the storm's going to get, he gets 12 hours. Okay, so active, I would extremely discourage any active floodplain measures, just because, though they're open to you, just because it's like a fire drill. When's the last time everyone in here did a fire drill with their family? Okay, one of the slides here was, about being in an NFIP floodplain, that you're 5 times more likely to have a flood in there than a fire. But fires are still pretty common. You see them all the time, okay? But when was the last time someone did their fire drill? They checked that the ladder that they need to get from their second floor window wasn't buried under mounds of trash, and they got the family up and any guests, and everybody knows how to do it. It just doesn't happen, okay? So active floodproofing measures are discouraged unless you're somebody like the federal government and you've got a good staff on site to do it. And then even then, I don't see a whole lot of trust in that. So.
Yeah, I think Councilmember Kovar and Kostick had some questions, but we're going to try and wrap up in 5 minutes. Councilmember
Okay,
Kovar?
5 minutes.
Quick, yeah. We have 5 minutes.
So, thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
So I can talk a lot about this.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'll try to, I'll limit it to one question then. But, so the information that we have shows a certain foot level for the floodplain, and I think it's 209 feet of an elevation, and then there's a wall outside that's at 210 feet, and then as I understand it, the requirement would be, but the floor is only at 209 feet. So does the county, I mean, I don't know, this is probably a more complicated question than I'm making it, but what does the county require? Does the floor of the structure have to be a specified distance above whatever that determined floodplain level is?
Yes, and the reason is that flooding often doesn't come through overland flow. It will back up through your sewer lines. So your basement elevation could be protected by outside structures that'll basically create a dam around you, but you're still going to experience flooding unless you've taken measures to prevent it from that sewer from backing up in. You could do what we said, wet floodproofing, minimizing the amount of damage that you would receive in these areas if it did happen. You could do dry floodproofing to prevent it from coming in. And if you've done the dry floodproofing and you've effectively proven that this area isn't affected by it, then you can have your floor elevation not in the floodplain there at that limited area, if that made sense.
But normally you have to exceed that?
Our requirement is 1 foot above the design elevation, 1 foot above the 100
For the
meter.
floor of the structure?
For the lowest floor.
Okay.
But you want to go to the expense of, and you want to go to the expense of putting in passive flood control, dry floodproofing measures that will protect that area, then we would let you put in a floor elevation that's lower. There would be a much more stringent review from not just me, but the building department as far as how that is done. And even when that is done, we would encourage you to move sensitive infrastructure outside of that area. Move your electrical panels well above, move any servers that you have, keep the area of damage to conference rooms, etc.
And this is, if I just want to follow up,
Yeah.
one of the things that you'll see on the various maps that we've gotten so far is that elevation changes, so it's not just the 209. So that's part of the issue, is where these various points are.
Councilwoman Kostick.
Thank you. I just had a quick clarification on the passive versus active. Would you consider a higher floor level to be a passive measure, or is that sort of just an infrastructure element?
When you've elevated your building so that you are above that floodplain, you are in compliance with the floodplain ordinance, and nothing more needs to be said about it.
Okay.
Dry floodproofing, wet floodproofing is for when that floor elevation is below it and it can't exceed it. What do we do then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it has to be clear. We don't permit this for residences. They're single-family residences. We won't allow you to do dry or wet floodproofing. They just don't have the wherewithal to maintain that kind of stuff. We assume corporations, municipalities, entities will take a serious interest in that protection of their infrastructure over the long term.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Davala.
So what triggered this in the first place is the old stream that's buried because of in the stormwater pipes.
Yep.
That's the pink line that doesn't look like a stream if you look out the window. Okay. And then what triggers the revision of the delineation is the change in the building, or
The change in the profile
changing the profile of the building?
of the
okay.
water course flowing across this site.
Changing the profile of the water flow.
And remember,
Okay.
and I'm not familiar, I'd have to look at AdTech's hydraulic and hydrologic analysis. A storm drain, normally, even when it's designed appropriately and constructed, is not designed for the 100-year event. It's not designed to convey that much. We look at storm drains assuming all of the inlets to them to be clogged. So the capacity of this storm drain for your floodplain, and this is why we got into talking about, is it flooding or is it a floodplain?
Mm-hmm.
You know, For a floodplain, we consider all of those inlets to be clogged so that all of the water that would have gotten into that storm drain is flowing overland and is going to come into your site across the surface. So the changes that you do to the surface affecting the profile is what's going to require that floodplain delineation study. It's going to change the course of water path, and you need to identify it.
Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Smith?
Thank you for the presentation.
Yes,
I
sir.
want to make sure I understand this. You're saying that if we go forward with this project, we're asking the residents of Tacoma Park to assume a 26% chance that this property, this building will flood?
The 26% chance is the probability that a 100-year event will happen will be equal or exceeded over 30 years.
Right.
Okay, so 30 years. The probability of it happening in any 1 year is 1%
Right.
chance.
Right.
We would not permit you to put in anything that's in that 100-year that has not been designed via active or passive dry flood proofing or wet flood proofing. Meaning, if you have a portion of the building that is low and you say, we are not going to try to protect it, we're going to put concrete floor and not, instead of gypsum board, concrete walls or cement particle board walls that do not get affected by water inundation. There'll be no electrical panels. That's wet flood proofing. That is accepting the fact that this area is going to be flooded, and then when it does, it's a lot easier to clean up and restore. It's not appropriate for a library. It's not appropriate for community centers. Is it appropriate for a gym? Maybe.
And so, you've been doing this for a long time. Do you recommend, if you had, a voice in this process, would you recommend a municipality to, or any other government agency to build within a floodplain if they had the option not to?
Yes, absolutely. Land is valuable. Land is valuable here. This is a tremendous resource you have here, and you're looking at making it better. You're weighing a risk versus a reward. I don't want to discourage anyone from, it's my job to discourage you.
Right. Right.
Okay?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's my job to discourage you and try to get you to consider all of the possible consequences. But when you've done that, when you've met it to the letter of the law, and there'll be a lot of times, I've worked with Jason for a long time, Mr. Fritz at AdTech, and I will tell him, consider this. I don't have any regulatory authority to make you do it, but it's a good idea. Consider doing this, consider doing this. I will throw that out a lot, I will tell him, I suggest you do this. It's very different than when I tell him, you're not allowed to do that.
All right, thank you.
Great. I think on that note, we will end on this part. I thank you very much. I'm sure we will be calling you and talking to you some more as we go through this process. But I think I'm okay speaking on behalf of my colleagues up here to say this was really invaluable as for us to understand the difference between flooding and floodplains and what we're looking at as we consider renovation of the library. So thank you very much for coming this evening.
Could I do a plug? I'd like to leave
Yeah.
my business card. My job is here for not just you, but everyone. So if anybody has a question, I am their representative, and they can ask. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Call me directly and say, what does this mean?
Great. Terrific. Yes, you can leave your cards. We have a table over here if you want to put some business cards there. I'm sure people will pick them up.
Thank you.
And we're not shy here in Tacoma Park, so you may just want to open an office here. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're just going to take about 5 minutes just to kind of get everything regrouped, and then we'll start our meeting. Thank you.